Hi everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be chatting to you about some books that I think will make great reads for June. I love seasonal reading, which you'll know very well if you follow my channel, and over the past few months I've been putting together reading lists that I think are appropriate for every month of the year. I can't wait to share my June reading suggestions with you all, so I hope you'll go make a cup of tea or some kind of refreshing beverage and join me to discuss some wonderful reads for June. So I've divided up my recommendations into three main categories for you. First, I'm going to share some great fiction reads for June. Then I'll share some children's book recommendations. And then finally, I'll finish up with some non-fiction books and books that I'll be having on my bedside table throughout June. So let's get started first with fiction. The first book I'm going to recommend for June is actually the Comfort Book Club choice this month. I host the Comfort Book Club with my mum Donna, and on the last Friday of every month we talk about a favourite comfort book. This month's choice is A Sky Painted Gold by Laura Wood. And this is a brilliant June read. It's the perfect book if you're just sitting out having a lazy afternoon in the garden on the weekend, or if you're lucky and you're by the seaside and you want a light, pleasant book to read, then this will make an excellent choice. It starts in June, it's a real summer read, it's a YA book, but loads of adults have been really enjoying Laura Wood's books, me included, and it's just the perfect book to pick up if you're in the mood for something light and charming. If you've read books like I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith, or if you're a fan of Georgette Hare, then I think you'll recognise echoes of those authors in Laura Wood's book. This is set in Cornwall in the interwar years, and it's about a young girl who yearns to be a writer, but she also very much wants to escape her lovely but slightly monotonous existence in Cornwall. She lives with her family in a big sort of rambling farmhouse, and her elder sister has just got married. And she realises that she wants maybe something more than marriage in her life. She wants to be a writer, but she doesn't know how to meet her ambitions. And then one day she meets a brother and sister who own a big house on a small island just off the coast of Cornwall. It sounds a lot like St. Michael's Mount if you know Cornwall. And this brother and sister, they throw very lavish, Gatsby-ish style parties, and the young heroine of the book gets very intrigued by them and starts to mix in their social circle. So a fun, light read, and I can't wait to discuss it at the end of the month for the Comfort Book Club. Then an absolute classic summer read, again a perfect book for reading out in your garden or by the seaside, is The Summer Book by Tove Jansson. And this is based a lot on her own experiences as a child, and it's a lovely book because it shows a really fond connection between a grandmother and a granddaughter. The young girl in this book has just lost her mother, and a very special bond forms with her grandmother. It starts in, I think it starts in July, but some of the chapters, it's the sort of book you can dip in and out of, and there's a chapter on midsummer, which I'm looking forward to reading in the run-up to midsummer, and it's the sort of book that you can also read slowly and really savour all through the summer, sort of starting in June. And it's a really sort of sun-drenched, beautiful story, set on an island just off from Finland, and a real classic of summer. It's been years since I've read it, and I'm looking forward to picking this up again. And then another fun light read is The Windsor Knot by S.J. Bennett. This actually starts in April and is more of a spring read in terms of the season that the book is set in, but I'm suggesting it as a June read because the start of June saw the Platinum Jubilee, and I really enjoyed all of those celebrations and got very much in the Jubilee spirit. And The Windsor Knot is one that I would recommend if you want to carry on with that Jubilee feeling a little bit more in June. It's about Her Majesty the Queen as an almost Miss Marple type figure. In S.J. Bennett's books, Her Majesty solves crimes very much behind the scenes with the help of her young assistant Rosie. And although the mystery wasn't spectacular, I have to say, in this book, I still found it a really quick, fun read, and I really enjoyed all the background knowledge that S.J. Bennett clearly has about the workings of the royal family and the different palaces, for instance, and just all this background detail and knowledge that goes into the running of Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace and what it takes to be a member of staff of the Queen, for instance. I don't know much about that kind of thing. I've only ever even seen one season of The Crown, for instance, so I don't know much about this. And I found that really interesting, just reading a bit of the sort of behind the scenes. So I enjoyed the book for that reason, and it was just quite a fun light read as well. So a good summer read in that sense, definitely. And then something a bit darker, definitely a lot less of a light read, but a perfect June read, is Cassandra at the Wedding by Dorothy Baker. This was written in the 1960s. This is one of those books where you look at the quote that they put on the front cover, "Knowing and Wise, a dark comedy about marriage, The Guardian." And once you've read the book, you think, did that reviewer even read the book? I don't know. To me, this is not a book about marriage. It's definitely a book about what it means to be a twin. It's a book about independence or lack of independence. It's really about codependency and the struggle to lead an independent life. So Cassandra, it starts out on a sort of hot June day, and Cassandra is a young woman who decides to go back a day early to her family's home ranch in California. She goes back a day early for her twin sister's wedding. And I love the tone of this book. It's fantastically written. There's a very, very dark undertone to the story, but there's also a lot of wit and humour, and it's just very sharp and sassy in tone. Cassandra's voice really comes through. The story is told in 3 parts. First you get Cassandra's perspective, then you get her twin sister Judith's perspective, and then it switches back to Cassandra again. As the story unfolds, Cassandra unravels more and more and more, and you get more of an idea of her background, the recent death of her mother, and other factors that contribute to her eventual mental breakdown. It's a great hot summer read, set in the California heat. Cassandra and Judith bond together as they swim in the swimming pool, but eventually what becomes clear is that Judith very much wants to live her own life and a life with someone else, her new husband, and Cassandra doesn't know how she herself can survive without Judith always being there for her. They have obviously an incredibly unique bond as twins, and one of them finds it much, much harder to break away from that bond. So, like I said, this is quite a dark read, but it's a great hot summer story. and it's quite a page turner as well. So one I recommend for that. And then another more serious book, but a brilliant read for June, is of course Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Dalloway Day this year is the 15th of June, which I think is next Wednesday. So this is a great time to read Mrs. Dalloway if you've never read it before, to reread it. And if you Google Dalloway Day, then you'll see some of the events surrounding that day this year, and you might enjoy registering for some of those talks or getting involved somehow in the day. I love this edition of Mrs. Dalloway. I've talked about this quite a bit on the channel before. It's the annotated edition, and it features maps of the different walks all the different characters take in London in the novel. The novel is of course set on a Wednesday in the sort of middle of June, and I think a really fun thing to do if you're in London would be to go on one of the walks featured in the book on Dalloway Day. So another brilliant read for June. And then I wanted to share some children's books with you. I've spoken before about how much I love the Vanderbeekers series by Karina Yan Glaser. This I think is the second book in the series. It's the Vanderbeekers and the Hidden Garden, and it starts at the end of June. So in America, that's the beginning of the summer holidays. And this one is all about how the Vanderbeeker children come together and also work with their community to build a community garden, which is quite a challenge because they don't have any plants, they don't have really much gardening knowledge or experience at all, and they don't have any money really either. But it's a really delightful book. I love this series. It's about a mixed race family who live in Harlem and about their neighbours in the actual sort of brownstone building that they live in, as well as their neighbours within the wider community. They're really sweet, charming reads that adults can enjoy as well as children. Great books to share with children in your life for sure, but I also just like reading them for my own pleasure too, because I find them such sweet stories, and I love the sense of community that comes out in this book, and well, in all of the books, and they're also all a real love letter to Harlem. So if you're a New Yorker, then I think you'd really love these as well. And then I don't know if any of you remember the Linnea books, Linnea and Monet's Garden, and there were a few other picture books about Linnea. I loved these as a child, and I've recently started getting a few of them again, and one that I think would be perfect for children in June is Linnea's Windowsill Garden. So if you're already a fan of Linnea Monet's Garden, which was the sort of first classic one in the series, all about the young girl Linnea visiting Monet's Garden in France, I would also recommend some of the other ones, and Linnea's Windowsill Garden is such a fun book with loads of ideas for little experiments and projects that you can do with children, all about growing plants or foraging for plants. It's really sweet, really fun. Like I said, lots of activity ideas and some science things, like this is all about the water cycle, for instance, but all of these sort of teachable moments are done in such a fun, engaging way for children, and I really do recommend this little series. And like I said, I adored Linnea when I was little. I even had my own Linnea doll. And I think that it's just such a great little series to share with children. And in the summer, when you can grow things together and children are noticing all the changes that happen in this season, this is a great little book to accompany that. And this one I just picked up secondhand. I'm not sure if they're still in print, sadly, but you can find them pretty cheaply secondhand, and I definitely recommend them. And then finally, I wanted to share a children's picture book with you. So I bought this one because I just fell in love with the gorgeous illustrations. It's A Rose Named Peace, how Frances Meland created a flower of hope for a world at war. And it's all about how this particular rose, the peace rose, was created. And it's a lovely story, a very poignant story, because war, of course, comes into this. But the illustrations are just so beautiful. It's really wonderfully done. Gorgeous, real full page sort of illustrations. And it's such a touching story as well, and a true story too. So one I really recommend as a picture book for this month. Of course, June is the month that roses really come into their own, and this is just such a lovely picture book to accompany that. So it's illustrated by Bagram Ibertulin. I hope I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, I'm afraid, so apologies. But absolutely gorgeous illustrations and a really beautiful book and a lovely story. So I thought I'd recommend that one this month. And then let me move on to some non-fiction recommendations. So the first non-fiction book I want to recommend is this gorgeous one, Cottage Pie by Marjorie Hessel Tiltman. This is a vintage book, but if you can find a copy, then I so recommend it. It's a really charming story about, it's almost in sort of diary form. It starts in June, and it's about Marjorie Hessel Tiltman living in this cottage with her husband. It's a cottage they built together, and it's about her initial time spent living in the cottage. And there's just so much charm to this. It's really inspired my mum and myself, for instance, because in the June section at the start of the book, Marjorie talks about them having wonderful breakfasts outside in June, and my mum and I really want to try and spend a bit more time out of doors. So whenever the weekend is sunny at the moment, or even early in the morning during the weekday, if it's a sunny morning, then we try and take our cup of tea outside and have breakfast, or at least our first cup of tea outside of the day. And it's made such a wonderful difference to how we start the day. It can be such a mood booster just to spend that bit of time out of doors. And that was really inspired by this book. And the June chapter, Marjorie talks about having breakfast outside in June and how much joy they have. They have a very nice sounding breakfast, I have to say, with all these homemade preserves and homemade foie gras and bread rolls brought down from town for every week. And ours is not as fancy as that, but just the idea of having breakfast outside as much as possible in June was really inspiring. So this starts in June. You can see there are lovely illustrations that go through the book as well. And it goes all through the year. But it's one that I really recommend. And if you can find a copy online, then it's one that I think is a joy to read and a great book to have on your bedside table and sort of read month by month through the year as well. And then another non-fiction book for June is Cuckoo in June by Alison Utley. Now, the title of this book, it says, was actually inspired by a Shakespearean quote. So it says, "He was but as the cuckoo in June, heard not regarded. The cuckoo in June was used by Shakespeare to suggest something familiar that by frequent repetition has ceased to make an effect. It has been Mrs. Utley's particular virtue as a writer on the countryside and on many other subjects to bring light, through her own perception and evocative writing, many things of beauty and interest that are too often taken for granted and not regarded." That is so true of Alison Utley's writing. So this is a collection of her essays. It's not particularly relevant to June. It's just that idea behind the title, but I woke up the other morning very, very early, and I was sitting having a cup of tea in bed, and I heard a cuckoo, and they're getting much more rare, sadly, to hear now, and it was just wonderful to hear that really distinctive call, and it got me very excited. And I remembered that an Alison Utley book was called Cuckoo in June, so nowadays that is certainly something you take notice of. It's not something you hear all the time that blends into the backdrop, but I do love how her writing generally does celebrate those things you maybe take for granted, especially in country living. So these chapters are on things like cupboards and hiding places, 100 jugs, going a-flowering, railways, canals, weeds, pennyworths and stars. I'm going to have to read that weeds chapter soon because I have some serious gardening I have to do this weekend, a lot of weeding, and if anyone can find some beauty and joy in weeds, then I'm sure that's Alison Utley, so I'll have to read that myself. But yeah, some beautiful essays in this book. I just love her writing on the countryside, so I couldn't resist adding this to my reading pile for June. And then an anthology that I'll have on my bedside table throughout the summer is, of course, Summer, an anthology for the changing seasons, edited by Melissa Harrison. I've spoken a lot about Melissa Harrison's seasonal anthologies before. This one is really lovely. It's full of essays, extracts from fictional books as well, poetry, all things that celebrate summer. So June is really the start of summer, and I've pulled out my anthologies. So I've got this one. I also have some here. The Nature of Summer by Jim Crumley. This isn't an anthology, but it's a really interesting look at the natural world in the summertime. And then A Poem for Every Summer Day is a lovely poetry anthology. So these are some books that I'm pulling out to have on my bedside table over the summer months ahead. And then I also have this anthology, which is Summer, a folio anthology. It's published by the Folio Society. I love their seasonal anthologies as well, and I've been dipping into their summer one already. And this features one of my very, very favourite poems for June. I think it's one of the most perfect poems for June. Very famous. That's Addlestrop by Edward Thomas. And I thought I'd just read you the first stanza because you can see why I would choose this as my poem for June. Yes, I remember Addlestrop, the name, because one afternoon of heat the express train drew up there, unwontedly. It was late June. So that's just the first stanza, and I'll link to a beautiful reading of the poem, much better than I could do, in the description box if you'd like to listen to it. I really recommend checking out this reading, it's lovely. But I do think that's the most perfect poem for June. I love Edward Thomas's poetry in general, but reading Addlestrop again inspired some more of my non-fiction choices of books to read this month, so I thought I'd share those with you. One of them is a biography of Edward Thomas by John Moore, The Life and Letters of Edward Thomas. I've wanted to read this for a long time, and I would like to try and read it this month. And very fittingly, one of the newest Persephone books that just came out was As It Was and World Without End by Helen Thomas, who was Edward Thomas's wife. And this is her memoir, her collection of 2 memoirs brought together in this single volume. And I just recently got this. It was one of Persephone's spring releases, and I've been really looking forward to reading it. So this will make a great companion read to Edward Thomas's biography and to just celebrating Edward Thomas through Addlestrop this month. So both of these are on my list to read. I'm interested too to read this John Moore biography because Persephone Books is bringing out a novel by John Moore in the autumn, which is The Waters Under the Earth. This will be one of their autumn releases. So I'm curious to read some of his non-fiction as well, and his biography of Edward Thomas is very famous. So I'm looking forward to getting to that. But anyway, those are all of my recommendations for June reading. I'd love to know if you could read one of these books this month. Which book would that be? Do let me hear, because I'm really fascinated to know your response to that. But I hope you have a wonderful weekend ahead. Maybe head out into the garden or somewhere lovely early in the morning and bring a good book and just enjoy the sunshine, let's hope, for this June weekend. But thanks so much for watching. Extra special thanks to those of you who pressed the super thanks button on my last video. That is always so much appreciated. So very, very big thanks to all of you, but thank you to everyone who watches and supports my YouTube channel. Have a wonderful weekend and I'll see you next week. Goodbye.